I'm delighted to be here with Professor Joe Gereboff, who is the Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies at ASU, as well as a visiting Associate Professor at HUC in Los Angeles and at AJR of California. He's the author of Rabbi Tarfon, The Tradition, the Man, and Early Rabbinic Judaism. His current research focuses on American Jewish responses to the Holocaust and its aftermath as expressed in periodical literature, and current research focuses on Judaism and the emotions. I'm delighted to be with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our topic today is around the issue of Torah and trauma. And first of all, how would you define trauma, and how does that relate to the Jewish view of trauma, would you say?
That's interesting. Trauma, I would think, are events that, in some sense, are there. Well, let's put it this way: there's a cognitive, and there's a emotional, and there's perhaps a social dimension to trauma. On a cognitive level, people would talk about somehow one's worldview is called into question. One's basic way of looking at life in light of events that occur is not just challenged, but almost is shattered. The premises of that worldview are thrown into question. And in a sense, perhaps they're not easily restored, at least initially. Trauma also cognitively, but in a different way, and what I find interesting in current literature is that people actually don't live in philosophical propositions. People live in a world of narratives, in a world of stories. And the question is, on the surface, does an event in some way prove to be unassimilatable, doesn't somehow fit within one's existing narrative through which they define themselves and define the world around them? That kind of disruption to one's sense of who one is in some sense then, of course, can have seriously emotional dimensions to them, manifesting in a variety of emotional responses, perhaps in issues of depression, including people who would then perhaps find in the extreme life being meaningless, which we know can translate into its most extreme form of people choosing to end their lives because they find life as meaningless, or the nihilism all they can affirm is some kind of nihilism, which may lead them to not want to go on, including, depending on the nature of the event, can also occasion a great deal of pain and suffering. So it's not simply cognitive, whatever gives rise to human experiences of pain. On a social level, it also can mean that, in a certain sense, to the extent to which our definitions of ourselves are always, in some sense, relative to how we see ourselves in relationship to others, then if a traumatic event can also radically call into questions one's self-understanding as they see themselves in relationship to others. The world they lived in that sense, is called into question. Perhaps betrayal by others or the sense of trust in others can give rise to on a social level. So those would be some of the dimensions, I think, that characterize trauma. I wanted to, before we talk about the Jewish sense, but we'll perhaps move us to the Jewish sense, is, of course, many people, when they think of the most traumatic event in recent history for Jews, of course, is the Holocaust. And there's a great deal of research on trying to understand how, particularly those who survived the Holocaust, came to terms with it. Obviously, all the dimensions I briefly spoke of above are characteristic of the events of the Holocaust, at least for many people. There are those, and we could talk about that, who have been able to fully assimilate the events of the Holocaust to a very traditional worldview they may have held, and perhaps if one traditional rabbinic view would be to say, going back to the way the rabbis eventually, as evidenced in the liturgy, responded to the destruction of the temple, where they'll say, Mipnei Chata'enu, it's our fault. We sinned, therefore these events have transpired. There are Jews who have responded to the Holocaust and simply sought to determine what was the sin we committed. Now, whether psychologically and they're fully adjusted, at least they put forward those kinds of rationalizations. But a lot of people have studied Holocaust survivors. One of the many of us, of course, as many people know of Steven Spielberg's project, where he interviewed many survivors. But there was an earlier project that was the records of which were kept in the Yale Library collection of a series of interviews with Holocaust survivors. And Lawrence Langer, who is a writer on Holocaust literature and Holocaust survivors, published a book a number of years ago. I believe the title was Holocaust Testimonies. And in this book, he sought to analyze the survivors. So he argues that, in essence, many of these survivors could not assimilate the events of the Holocaust into a coherent narrative. In some ways, they had a break in their self-understanding. And while they're able to go on with their lives, they had this gap. There's a large literature that's emerged. A particular scholar, which I don't need to go through in details, Kathy Caruth, has studied trauma in literature. And she argues there are two traits to trauma literature. Trauma literature is, in a certain sense, gives rise to a sort of lack of memory, a blocking of memory. But perhaps that translates into, essentially, we are the people who remember ourselves to be and that we envision to going forward. That may be like Langer's view. The second dimension that Caruth argued was in studying trauma literature was that for most people, traumatic events, ultimately there's a claim made that they're inexpressible. So they're unrememberable and they're inexpressible. If I would think that Elie Wiesel, in some ways, adopted that position, at least in his earliest writings, where he just said there's no way to put any of this in kind of words. There's nothing called Holocaust literature. There's a famous quote by Adorno on this idea: you can't express it. So that was Caruth. She didn't look at just so much Holocaust literature, but looked at trauma in general. So I just recently came across an article, and Caruth, who was a literary scholar, drew upon a number of psychologists. And then she said, well, this is what the psychologists tell us, and let me look at people who actually write these things, and they seem to have those traits. Just recently, I came across an article that actually refers to a person named Richard McNally, who is a Harvard professor, and he wrote a book called Remembering Trauma. And he argues that she's wrong. And contemporary psychology, in fact, does not validate the view that that survivors or people who undergo trauma do not remember it. They actually remember it very well, often, not always, but often, and they're able to express it. So it's fascinating here is, and I'm not a psychologist, so I can't say who's exactly right or wrong, but this is an interesting angle to think about, to what degree, if those were seen as definitional, defining traits, the lack of ability to remember and the inability to express, is that really true? And so that would be to start, some things to think about when you think about traumatic events and trauma literature.
Right. And how much more isolating if you can't actually communicate and build community around experience.
Though it's interesting to what degree someone like Wiesel seemed to have argued that those who were there understand.
Okay.
Right?
Interesting.
Those who were not part of it.
Right.
Well, in his initial work, he actually said, if you weren't there, you shouldn't write about it. Right? He took this position. You couldn't possibly understand this if you didn't experience it directly.
Okay, so moving away from survivors to next generations, and moving from personal trauma.
Correct.
Where would you say we're at with collective trauma today? To what extent have the Jewish people moved on, and how is this trauma continuing to affect our collective identity?
Well, it's interesting. Yesterday was having a conversation with somebody about what motivates Jews today, and they cited, I forgot what year it was, 1991, and Jews were asked what are the most important aspects of Jewishness, and number one was Holocaust. That was 1991. I would think if you asked those who would identify as Jewish today, particularly younger Jews, I'm not so sure that Holocaust would rate.
In the Pew study, it was still high. It was still high a few years ago, but it wasn't as high.
I think it's begun to go down sure. There's an interesting literature on this whole phenomenon of how does one, if one wants to, that's the question, but if one wants to, how does one create, in essence, a memory of an event that one did not experience themselves, right? And much of culture is about, and religions often try to communicate, say, this is your experience, right? The classic example would be what we're going to celebrate in 2 weeks, right? The Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, right? And as we, most of us know, the famous story of the 4 children. And the one who was called the wicked son of the Rasha, however you want to translate Rasha, why is he the Rasha? Because he says, what is the meaning of this to you?
Right.
And the way the story is constructed, this nice little story, right? The response is, well, since you have excluded yourself from this story, this is not your narrative. Right. Had you been there, you would not have been redeemed.
Right.
But in a certain sense, he said, that's not my story.
Right.
That's not who I am. I don't want to be in that sense. So if we contemporize this, somebody will want to say, well, I don't need to deny, I'm not a Holocaust denier. I don't deny that the event occurred.
I don't build my identity.
But I don't build my identity around that. I don't want to be defined by, I'm the people that everybody tried to kill.
Right.
I mean, some people have looked at Neil Fackenheim's notion of the 614th Commandment. Is that's not really all Fackenheim said, but on one level, the only reason you survive is not to let Hitler win.
Right.
That's not a very good reason to go on, being who you are is driven by a negative factor.
Surprisingly, a lot of the American Jewish discourse today is still built around survival, continuity and survival to some extent. I wonder if that's influenced by this.
Well, I would take it a slightly different direction. I think it's built around survival, but survival can be driven by just the opposite, the hospitable nature of America. And so the primary concern is assimilation. But to what degree, and this is, I think, an interesting issue that people have now begun to write about, in the fundamental consciousness of, let's say, American Jews and Israeli Jews, and perhaps now European Jews, that a dominant narrative in Israeli life is they're always out to kill us. Right, they're anti-Semites, whether we're anti-Semites, whatever we want to call it, anti-Zionism, right? This is all about they're always trying to kill us. In some ways, and I want to talk about this in a particular way, in some ways, do American Jews really think that way? The facts on the ground don't show it. I remember years ago when we used to, various Jewish organizations would promote, please support us because we're combating anti-Semitism. Right. I don't see, in and of itself, anti-Semitism, no one's denying there aren't anti-Semites. Right. And one has to be careful. Right. But to whatever degree it's anti-Semitism, perhaps it's morphed into anti-Zionism, right? And we could talk about to what degree is BDS a reality, but and so the BDS movement, I would say certain people want to promote that that's really evidence that there are constantly anti-Semites, they really want to get rid of Jews. Right. without getting into the particulars of BDS, I think there are people who equate one with the other. But my point here is it's interesting to track to what degree has anti-BDS become a project of the American Jewish community, which could be seen as a new manifestation of, they're always trying to get us, we're always living in this precarious existence, and we've never got over this sense of, we are under threat.
Right. And I think what contributes to that also is that I think that Jewish history has been taught to youth primarily as the narrative. We had a state, then we were oppressed for 2,000 years, and then we had a state, with bracketing the fact that there were many quiet and safe periods throughout history as well.
Absolutely.
And so that teaching of history in that fashion perpetuates this notion of we are eternally victims. Anti-Semitism is sort of a metaphor that can never be contained, which is, to some degree is true.
So one of the best, perhaps, one could look at it, in terms of classical Jewish literature, biblical literature of trauma. So we could look at the obvious cases. The Book of Lamentations is a response to trauma. You could look at perhaps, it's more philosophical, the Book of Job, but you could talk about certain prophets, such as Jeremiah, Ezekiel, any of them who lived. And it's true, I would argue, and there's a particular recent book that came out that said we have to look at the formation of the Bible, the formation of the biblical text as we have it is really done either in the Babylonian exile or post-Babylonian exile, and in a certain sense, we're it's a literature of survivors, and that's true. But what about the Book of Esther? Now, is that trauma literature or not? We just celebrated Purim, right? Now, on the one side, the book is built around the threat. Right, and relative to the point you just made, of course, Haman's charge that he brings to the king why he should eliminate the Jews is Yesh Noam Echad. There's one people that they are totally different from everybody else, and therefore they really can't abide by the king's rules, and you basically got to get rid of them.
Right.
And on the one side, is that Jewish consciousness.
Right.
We always stick out, right? Or as we say, in the Haggadah, we'll say, B'chol dor v'dor. In every generation, they rise up to exterminate us. But to go back to the Book of Esther. Now, is this a literature? So it's set within, theoretically, the Jews of Persia. They're a minority. But what's its message? Because clearly the ending of the book is beyond whatever the chapter where the Jews, defend themselves against those who attack them. But the ending of the book is that Mordechai is elevated to be the second in command.
Right.
So if I'm sitting in Persia reading this book, do I think, you know what? On the whole, we do pretty well here.
Right.
Or is this really, nope, they're always out to get us, and we're really basically the status quo.
Now, and there's implications. I mean, the end of the book, the Jewish response with violence, that I think if you perpetuate the trauma narrative, I think you can abuse power. I'm not suggesting necessarily did, but
absolutely,
there's the possibility.
Absolutely. But the deeper issue there is, it depends how you look at the book, is the book historical, or is this a literary fiction?
Right.
That, and I would say, I don't find it problematic to say that people can engage profound truths through fictional literature.
Right.
The events don't really have to have happened. The Book of Job may be entirely a fiction, but it explores deep-seated human issues. So the book is obviously, it's a kind of parody. Anybody reading it, I mean, if you read it seriously, you're told right away, this is not real true. I mean, the depiction of the king with this grand party, unless you're a literalist and can't imagine that there's a biblical book that's a work of literature as opposed to meant to be a historical account, if you read it as a work of literature, then you're going to say, well, this is kind of fun. Why did we then create a kind of parody? Now, where does that emerge from? Does that emerge from our insecurity? And we're going to kind of laugh. So one way of people dealing with a certain situation where they're not full in control is to make fun of.
Right.
I can't get rid of the guy, really.
Right.
Think how people deal this with bosses. They get,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Think about, I would argue, much of Jewish humor.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you're stuck
Right,
with these
right.
people.
Yeah.
But between ourselves, if you know what we're really saying, we're
Right.
poking fun at
Right,
them all
right,
the time.
right.
So do we really think they're that much of a threat? Nah, we know better than they do.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting dynamic of the issues of power and powerlessness are very complicated.
Yeah. And the how close the founding of the State of Israel is to the Holocaust is not a healthy condition in a lot of ways.
No, and the dominant narrative that were it not for the Holocaust, the State of Israel would not have come into being. That may be true on one level, but the Holocaust alone would never have created the State of Israel had the Zionists moved there starting in 1880 and built an infrastructure. Nobody was going to create a State of Israel if there weren't facts on the ground to use that. Right? So maybe the Holocaust was a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition.
Here's my last question for you, and it's a massive one, but we only have a minute or two left. What is the main Jewish contribution to healing? We've been talking a lot about the negative dimension of the actual trauma, our historical, through books and through our history, how the stories have shaped us. But what do we have to contribute? What do we have to offer to the world, having experienced all this, as to how we heal from this?
Well, it's interesting. I would say in two levels. I think many of us are familiar with the idea that the Dalai Lama came to meet with this group of Jews.
A Jew in the Lotus.
Right, it's described in Chemnitz as Jew in the Lotus. Like, how did you survive outside your land for all these years? You're amazing people. And so to that degree, it is interesting to examine what was it in the Jewish reality, psyche, historical memory that allowed for a degree of resilience. Perhaps there's an element, maybe mitei chata'enu, it's our fault, is too strong, but to what degree were we willing to take some responsibility, right? It's always easy to blame the other. No, I'm not suggesting in any way, maybe the extreme trauma, maybe we didn't do anything. But in many cases, on micro level interactions, I mean, some ways, sometimes people contributed. We could start talking about contemporary events and potential catastrophes, whether it's global warming or whatever. To what degree do we just live in a world of denial, as if we have no contributing part? So I would say to the degree to which we were willing to take some responsibility, maybe we let God off the hook too much, but at least we took responsibility. We had a sense, and I think deep down there's a sense that the world is not necessarily perfectible, but it's improvable, right? And as I look at notions of, as the current understanding, Ted, with this notion of tikkun olam, whereas perhaps in Kabbalistic literature it really meant to put everything back to a state of perfection. I think as most people talk about tikkun olam as a list of bar mitzvah, the kids getting up and saying my tikkun olam project, they're looking at small acts of kindness, things to make life a little better. But I think it's on both levels, is the micro level in your interactions daily, but also it's to be cognizant of larger issues and to also propose what I think are realistic solutions, not pie in the sky. It's good to be, have great visions, but utopianism has its limitations on a practical level.
Well, I feel like we're just getting started, but we're out of time. So make sure to check out Professor Gereboff's wonderful writings. If you live in Northern California, Southern California, or Arizona, you can catch him in person.
Or on Southwest Airlines.
Professor Gereboff, thank you so much.